Welcome to Torn, the only podcast committed to exposing the truth about the child welfare system and its devastating impact on families of color. Told from the perspective of your hosts, Sonia Johnson and Classy Collinette, two defense attorneys who have over 15 years of experience working in the child welfare system.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Torn. This is a podcast featuring your hosts, Sonia Johnson, as well as myself, Classy Collinette. By way of background, I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Classy Collinette. I am a Black mother, a daughter, a wife, as well as an advocate in the trenches for parents and caregivers who are in the child welfare system, whether it's through a case or through a relative of theirs that happens to have a case. And I tout myself as someone who is committed to racial, social, economic, and climate justice. And I'm going to let my co-host, Sonia Johnson, introduce herself. Sonia, why don't you tell everybody who you are?
I'm Sonia Johnson. I, too, am a Black mother, a lawyer, a parent defender, working every day on helping families stay together. And I'm also a social justice activist.
Awesome. Well, so great to see you, my sister Sonia. It's always a blessed moment to share time and space with you, because we have an important topic that we're going to talk about today. And the topic that we're focusing on today is, does child welfare have a race problem?
Part two.
Part two, right. Yes. That's right, part two. And Sonia, you and I both know that we could do so many parts on this issue, but yes, this is part two. And last time we were talking about an article that came out in December of 2021 in New Jersey regarding the racism in New Jersey's child protection system. And today we're going to be looking at what's being done and what needs to still be done. And so that brings us to the next question, which is, has there been any progress in New Jersey? And Sonia, you and I both know that for the first time in our careers as defenders who have been representing parents and caregivers for a combined of over a decade, we had our first race equity training in 2020. And Sonia, could you, from your vantage point, could you tell our listeners what you thought about that training and perhaps what were some important parts of it?
I thought the training was excellent. It was a system-wide training where the state looked at the data, and based upon the data, they recognized that disproportionality was clear. That is, that the number of Black and Hispanic children represented in the system was disproportionate. They reviewed their policies system-wide, right, and set a goal of implementing meaningful change. So that was the overarching approach. During the training session that I participated in, I believe it was in the fall of 2020, I had the opportunity to hear a dynamic speaker by the name of Dr. Jessica Price, who teaches at Florida State University. And she talked specifically about strengthening families using a racial equity lens.
Yeah.
She began her presentation exploring the history and the policy implementation of child welfare in this country, starting all the way back to the Black codes that were enforced after the Civil War on up through the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which decentralized keeping families together. Dr. Price began to address the why. Why is there disproportionality? And she focused on 4 factors. One, socioeconomic factors, which we know tied directly to structural racism, right? Because
Right.
poverty is driving the disproportionality. That's one of the factors anyway. She talked about the visibility bias. That is, we send vulnerable population into social agencies, right? They've got to
Yes,
go
we
to
do.
the Department of Social Services for their benefits and so forth. And so
Right.
those social agencies then become reporters.
Right.
And so many of our clients get caught in the system as a result of just trying to access services. That's the visibility bias.
Mm-hmm.
She also talked about a geographic bias, and that is that more child welfare calls come from geographically dense areas. So in highly populated areas, there's more police, there are more teachers, there's more contact with our families. And then as a result of that, more calls are coming in. That does not necessarily mean, as you and I both know, that there aren't issues in more rural areas, but because in rural areas, you have a fewer contacts with the social service agencies, with police, and so forth. The calls aren't coming in as often. And then finally, implicit bias. And you and I have talked a little bit about implicit bias already. That is the unconscious or the prejudices that we all have about different types of people. And I think a lot of the bias or the racism talk was kind of centered and focused on the implicit bias piece of that. But Classy, there was also another speaker, right? That
oh my goodness,
phenomenal, right?
Yes. Oh my goodness. And Sonia, I think it's safe to say you and I both grew up in the Black church, and
yes,
anything about the Black church, we know how to use some tambourines. So let me just say that the second speaker, Dr. Khatib Waheed out of St. Louis, Missouri, when he was talking, I was looking for my tambourines. Let me just say that, okay? Because the brother was spitting knowledge,
facts,
and spitting truth, right?
Facts,
right? Hashtag facts. He was spitting hashtag facts that you and I have been talking about since we started doing this work. And he was focusing on racial equity, and he was talking about what was the definition of racial equity. He also talked about how we need to develop in achieving, and in order to achieve racial equity, we need to understand that this is going to be a transformative process of acknowledging and undoing historic, social, political, racial, and ethnic discrimination. And Dr. Waheed, I absolutely loved him because he did not sugarcoat anything that he was saying.
No, he did not.
Right.
Classy. Classy. You know, you and I were texting each other, all of our colleagues of color, we were texting each other. We were like, preach!
Right. I couldn't believe that that the powers that be had brought him on as a speaker, because we have never had such truth telling. And my only wish is that had been in person. And I know that it couldn't have been in person because we were still in the thick of the pandemic, but I would have loved to see the faces of my colleagues while Dr. Waheed was spitting hashtag facts. And Dr. Waheed, his training was phenomenal.
Absolutely.
And I think I think the portion that he covered was really, really helpful for our allies, right? Because there are some folks that want to help out, and they know that there's a problem. They don't know what they can do to help. And Dr. Waheed talked about that our allies who understand implicit bias and structural racism, these folks need to step up and say something when they see something. Right. So if you're in a case and one of our allies sees that there is a family that is being asked to jump through many more hoops than many other families are usually asked to jump through, that ally can stand up and say, Your Honor, this family shouldn't have to do that, because I just had a similar case where a family had similar issues and they didn't have to do that. And so I think perhaps we should take a step back and ask ourselves, are we asking this family to do this because this is a Black family or because this is a brown family? And so that was really, really, really important information that Dr. Waheed spoke about. But Sonia, you and I also talked about afterwards that there was some part of the training that was missing. Right. What do you think was missing from the training, Sonia?
Well, while I think it was absolutely excellent training, and that if you didn't have an understanding before of the history of racism in this country, and if you didn't understand structural racism, and you didn't understand all of these terms that are being thrown out, that was clearly provided. And as you said, our allies now have more information, and hopefully we have more allies as a result of the information that was provided. And I think that is true. And I do think that there is or has been some change. But I think what the training was missing is two things. One, we focused a lot on implicit bias, structural racism, and those kinds of things, which we can all kind of understand and work to dismantle. But what we didn't touch upon is conscious bias, racism, white supremacy. We didn't talk about that at all. And we didn't talk that there was, for me, the assumption that once you have all of these facts, that you are going to be moved to do things and to do things differently.
Right.
But you and I both know that that's not necessarily the case. And despite the efforts that have been made and are being made, things are progressing very, very slowly. And in fact, to me, it seems a little like that term, all deliberate speed, and that was, of course, the term that came down from the Supreme Court in the Brown versus Board of Education, that desegregation, the states were to desegregate with all deliberate speed. It was just undefined, right? So that you really couldn't measure it. And that's what it kind of feels like. So that leads me to kind of the second critique that I have, and that is that we did not establish a system of accountability from my vantage point. Right. I don't know if you feel differently, but from my vantage point, it's like, okay, the mandate has gone out. We're doing things differently. We're strengthening families with a racial equity lens, meaning we're seeing, okay, this is happening with Black families. How are we going to do things differently? Yet and still, with all that's been taught, with the mandates going out, I don't see the dramatic progress. Do you?
I don't. And Sonia, that's the accountability piece is really important, because it's how all of us can measure if we're meeting specific goalposts, right? So if there is no accountability system in place, it almost feels like we're walking in the dark. And, the further we get in the dark, we're like, oh, okay, we got here. Oh, all right. But not really like, okay, I met this milestone or I accomplished this. And so because of that, I understand that I have now reduced the amount of Black and brown children in the system by X percentage. But Sonia, that brings me to the next piece, which is, what can we do? How do we make the system more equitable? Because I know so many of our listeners, like you said, they got the information from Dr. Price and Dr. Khatib Waheed, and we talked about what was missing. But now the question is, how do we folks that are in the system every day in the trenches, what steps can we do to make the system more equitable? What do you think, Sonia?
I think that there are a number of things that we can do now. And certainly some things, if we did them now, we would see a great impact. And some things, it's going to take some time, but we can start pushing for those changes now. So one of the first things, and I think this is something that's going to take time, but we need to be making the arguments now. And that is the system needs to not be reformed, but completely reimagined. Mm-hmm. We need to shift the focus of the system, because you and I both know that the current system is one that focuses on taking children away from their parents in an effort to try and protect them. But we need to focus on keeping children with their families and finding safe ways to do that. And I think if we made that shift, we would certainly begin to see a greater impact in terms of the disproportionality that we're seeing now and the disparity that we're seeing now. Well, right. What do you think, Classy? What other things could we do?
One other thing that I think would be helpful is implementing a blind removal process. And Dr. Jessica Price talks about this in her phenomenal TED Talk, where she explained how there was a county in New York that implemented blind removals. And blind removals essentially means that all identifying information about a family or a child is redacted to and then provided to the decision maker, which is the ultimate person that determines in the child welfare agency whether or not a child should be removed from his or her home. So in that county, Dr. Price talked about how when the child welfare agency in that county removed all indicators of race, whether it's address, zip code, last name, first name, other names of relatives, when all of that information was redacted and there was situations that arose where a decision maker in the child welfare agency had to make a decision about whether or not a child should be removed, by redacting all identifying information, that agency was able to reduce the amount of Black children going into foster care by a significant percentage. And I think that's a testament to what we already know, which is that there is racism in the system.
Right.
And I think that that's something that should be implemented on a nationwide basis.
Absolutely.
I think every child welfare agency across these United States should implement that blind removal process and see what happens, right?
And you know what, Classy, that's the thing. That's something that doesn't need to take years to happen. That's something that could happen like right now.
Right.
Each agency, child welfare agency, can adopt this policy change and implement blind removals and see.
Yeah.
You know? So, another thing that I think that we could do to make the system more equitable, this is something that may not be something that we can do overnight, but it certainly should be something that we should be looking towards changing. And that is reallocating the resources and the services. Right now, you and I know, at least in our state, the entity, the child welfare system, or the Division of Child Protection and Permanency, the entity that is responsible for prosecuting cases against parents. And that's exactly what it is. It's not a wishy-washy feely thing. They are prosecuting cases against parents, hold all of the money. They hold the purse strings. They have all of the connections to the service providers. And so if we reimagine child welfare where the prosecuting agency or entity doesn't withhold all the purse strings, and it's either placed in an independent agency or organization or placed on the defense side, so that parents can facilitate services without having to ask the agency that is prosecuting them to get those services, or get whatever monies are needed so that they can address the issues that brought their family into the child welfare system in the first place. I think if we did that, that would have a phenomenal impact on our families.
Yeah. No, and just to build on that, I think it also would be helpful to have more judges who are willing to order the child welfare agency to spend the money that they receive to help families to get the support and empowerment that they need. So it also is going to take some brave officers of the court who are willing to stand up and say, you know what? I'm ordering you to pay for this family to be in a hotel until they locate housing. So that way they are not homeless, and these children do not have to go into non-relative foster care. So that's certainly going to be really, really helpful. And Sonia, what else do you think?
Well, class, before we go on, because you would think that that's what's happening, right?
Right.
You would think that when a family shows up before a court and they need X service or an X item, say, for instance, a cell phone during a pandemic, so that when we switched over to remote hearings, and parents did not have either a cell phone or electronic device, and we as defense attorneys were standing up and saying, well, right now, a critical device or service that is needed is a telephone or a laptop. So either the parent can participate in counseling or the hearings themselves, or communicate with their caseworker. And I was shocked, and I'm sure you were, to learn that the division has a provision in its policy that prohibits it from providing cell phones to parents. And so when we were standing up asking for what clearly was a need in the middle of a global pandemic, we could not get judges to order it.
Yeah, Sonia, that's an interesting one, because I've had different results. I think it depends on the judge.
Okay.
I think it may also depend on who the prosecutor is. I've worked with some prosecutors who will say on the record, yeah, this parent does need a cell phone, Your Honor, which of course makes my job way more easier, right, when it's time for defense to talk, because it's like, well, if the prosecutor just told Your Honor that, you already know what my client needs, and I will certainly reiterate that. So, Sonia, but see, that's another problem that I know you and I didn't foresee talking about today, but I'm just going to say it. It's the uneven application of these so-called policies that the Child Welfare Agency touts around, right? And even in our own experience, and particularly me, who's had an opportunity to be in many counties in the state of New Jersey, each county operates very differently. And so what is a policy in one county is non-existent in another county. And, that's, I believe, again, that ties in with the red tape issue that you talked about, or perhaps I think you're going to talk about soon. But that is another issue, and quite frankly, is an important piece of helping to make the system more equitable.
Right. So, I mean, another thing that can be done now is to remove the red tape that you were just talking about, and to make things more equitable across the state. So the fact that you were able to get a phone for your client, and I'm battling away in the middle of a pandemic, arguing, well, Judge, they don't have a phone. How can they contact the caseworker? How can they participate in these hearings? That's, I guess, less red tape, but just the policy needs to be applied consistently across the state. But to
Right.
the issue of red tape, because that's where, you and I know that that's where licensing concerns and licensing, when we're talking about licensing, it's when we've got a family member that's been identified that wants to be a resource for the child and the parent who is currently involved with the system. There are all of these licensing requirements that the state requires the family member or the caregiver to reach.
Right.
So for instance, and by licensing, we're talking about that caregiver has to become a licensed foster care home. Even
Right.
if the only child they want to foster is their grandchild or niece or nephew, they still have to become a licensed foster care home. And you and I both know that we've had many caregivers not able to qualify or meet the licensing requirements because of things like maybe their home was too small, or maybe they did not
Right.
have sufficient bedrooms, or they wanted to be caregivers for a boy and a girl, and they needed two separate bedrooms, or they're whatever the issues were, that they're not able to meet those licensing requirements. They are otherwise qualified to provide the care, but they can't.
Mhm.
So we need to definitely find a way to remove red tape. Classy, do you remember? Because I've thought that after we kind of gone through this training and there was the discussion of looking at policies and changing policies, that there had been some discussion about easing up on those licensing requirements. Do you remember
Yeah.
anything like that?
There has been some easing up on the requirements. And of course, you and I could spend a whole nother episode explaining what some of those ease ups have been, or relaxing of rules. But I know that there is the biggest, or one of the most important changes, is there's not this heavy focus on whether or not a relative who is trying to be licensed has been substantiated in the past and then suddenly just being ruled out based on that. There's now a focus on determining how long ago did that substantiation happen? What have you done since that substantiation, right? Have you had any other interaction with the child welfare agency? If you have, was it related to real abuse, or was it like many of our cases, Sonia, where it's neglect, where who knows, a kid was home alone because grandma was working that day, her second job, and so she didn't get home. But that has been very helpful. The easing up of the rules have been very helpful in some of my cases. But what I've noticed is that, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say what you just said. I'm sitting here like holding my head. I don't know. I may need to transfer to your county, because I have a case right now with a grandmother with a beautiful, I believe it's a 4-bedroom home, trying to get her her grandkids out of foster care. And the division has basically ruled her out based upon a 30-year-old substantiation.
Okay.
So is there a policy, or do I just need a name? And you may need to drop that name for me.
You and I can certainly talk about name dropping after this episode if that's what you need, because I'm certainly willing to help you in that regard. But what I will say is something else that many grandmas have used, in my experience, is they've just went ahead and gotten FD custody.
Right.
So they've given up on the licensing process, and if they can't meet it, or they happen to be in a county like the one you're referring to, where people want to keep giving them a hard time, they just go in and ask for FD custody. And under FD custody, in my experience, most grandmas can get it. They prefer to get licensed because, of course, they will get that monthly stipend that every grandma deserves and should be able to have, particularly like the grandma you're talking about who has 4 grandbabies. That's a lot of mouths to feed.
Right.
And for those listening, FD custody is what we refer to in our state of New Jersey, where a relative or a caregiver comes in and they ask for legal and physical custody of their grandchild or the child that's involved in the proceeding. So I did just want to define that for our listeners, because I know we have folks tuning in from all over the country, but that's really what I'm referring to. A relative saying, I don't want to deal with the licensing process. I attempted, I've been unsuccessful, and now I'm just seeking legal and physical custody. And many times both parents are in support of that. And ultimately the decision is up to the judge as to whether or not that grandmother should get legal and physical custody of that child or children.
And that's exactly right, Classy. And I know that you've already said it, that is an option for relatives.
Right.
But when you're talking about a number of kids, not everybody can afford it.
Right.
Some people need that stipend so that they can provide for their relative, and it shouldn't be this hard.
Absolutely.
But that's certainly something that at least you've had some experience with a change. I'm still waiting for that change to happen where I'm currently practicing. Something else that we could do to address or make the system more equitable is stop using psychological evaluations to determine what services to offer a family, right?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh.
And Classy, you and I, this is a passion that we both share, because you and I both know that psychologicals are used in the system to essentially identify the services that the state believes the family needs. And we've talked about this before. Every psychological comes back as recommending individual services and recommending parenting classes. You and I, we've also talked about how the instruments that are used by the psychologists are instruments that have been used historically to either misdiagnose or to over pathologize families of color. Now, what's something that we could do instead of using these psychologicals classes? What's something that we could do?
Right. So one thing that we could do is conduct in-depth interviews with families, because many times, Sonia, a family knows what solutions are going to be helpful for them to be set up for success. So, and this is often overlooked, because the Child Welfare Agency, and I am able to see things from different vantage points. So I understand that the Child Welfare Agency, when they come in, they determine that they need to get involved with the family, whether that means putting a child in foster care or just opening a case to assist a family. But there's always this rush to, quote unquote, fix the family. And rarely does anyone ever take a step back and say, well, let me first have a sit down with the parent and their support network. And let's first figure out how you got in this predicament. What led to this? Does your support network know that you were dealing with these issues that led to your involvement with the Child Welfare Agency? So that's really, really important, the in-depth interviews. And something that has now been rolled out in our state is a focus on solution-based casework, which is really just that, asking families to and incorporating family voice in the solutions that are developed for a family.
And so you're exactly right about that, Classy. And I've seen solution-based casework rolled out in the areas where I practice. We need to have complete buy-in from the caseworkers that are supposed to be doing it. I really think that if they focused on working with families instead of dictating to families, we can really identify what needs to be done, what's most helpful, because you and I also know that many times our clients are ordered to attend a particular service, and if they don't buy in, it's really wasting everyone's time. If you're ordered to sit down with a therapist because they think that you need individual counseling in the area that you don't believe you need individual counseling in, you're not going to have that engagement and you're not going to progress. And so we're really just wasting time. So taking a more team-based approach, a more collaborative approach with the family would be more successful.
Right. Yeah. And Sonia, before we move on from the psychological evaluation issue, let's also highlight that you and I both learned about the American Psychological Association apology letter.
Ooh, yeah.
And in that letter, the American Psychological Association, which I'll refer to as the APA, acknowledged that psychological testing has historically been used to promote racism, racial discrimination, and racial hierarchy.
AKA white supremacy.
What'd you say?
AKA white supremacy.
Right. Exactly. Right. So
that was astounding, right?
That was, yeah. No, that was astounding, right? And that alone, Sonia, should have obliterated the use of psych evals.
It should have. It should have. And we made an effort to try and obliterate it, right?
And we're never going to give up.
Absolutely not.
I still bring it up in each and every one of my cases.
Right.
When there's a psych eval that's requested, I ask that the state give that evaluator the APA apology letter. It is what it is. They've been giving it out. I have yet to have a case where I needed to cross-examine an evaluator on them receiving receipt of the letter and taking it into account. So that'll be interesting. But I am requesting that they give it to them.
Well, like you, I refer to the letter often. I ask for culturally competent psychologists when the psychologicals are ordered. And recently, my request for a culturally competent psychologist was granted. I also asked for information about the assessments that would be used, because you and I both know from that letter that the letter clearly states that the assessments that have historically been used are problematic. So I asked for the assessments, and I guess there's been some pushback because I just opened up my email box the other day and saw that there's a motion for reconsideration of the judge's granting of that request. It's like, are you serious? I'm asking that not only do you use a culturally competent psychologist, but that culturally competent psychologist use culturally competent assessments, or at least explain how they're going to mitigate. Thank you. The problems with the assessments previously or historically used. And so there's pushback on it. And I'm thinking to myself, what, you don't want it to be fair?
Right.
You don't want it to be right? Yeah. Okay. But so Classy, we'll continue the good fight with regards to psychologicals. You and I both know that there are some states that are beginning to look at the use of psychologicals, the use of another concept called bonding evaluations, and we could talk about that on another show. But there is this process of beginning to reevaluate the use of psychologicals in our cases. But as we think about some other ways that this system can be more equitable, I think something that is clearly needed is we need to hire and retain more culturally diverse judges, deputy attorney generals, the people who prosecute the cases for the Division of Child Protection and Permanency, the law guardians, the attorneys who represent the children in these cases, and parent attorneys, as well as service providers, those individuals that actually provide the services to our clients, be they a substance abuse counselor, be they parenting coaches, that they all need to be culturally competent. Because you and I both know that there are very few of us, and by us, I'm referring to people of color doing this
Right.
work on any
Yeah.
side of the verses.
Yeah. No, definitely. And Sonia, that's really, really important because it's going to bring in individuals who have the lived experience and most importantly have a different lens on life, right? Because all of us view these cases based on who we are and our own lived experience, as well as our knowledge of structural racism and just racism as a whole.
Right.
So we need to have individuals who understand that racism is real and that they have to take steps to mitigate racism in the role that they have in these cases. And so what's really important, and I will get into this when we get to our tips, but I think that there is a way in which our allies can bring in more culturally competent attorneys, judges, as well as other community stakeholders that are often part of our cases. And it's not hard, but it really boils down to recruiting in a different way. So most recruiting is done by word of mouth. And that word of mouth is within our own safety nets, for lack of a better word, right? The folks that look like us tend to be the people that we spread word of mouth opportunities to. So you're going to have to step outside of your pool of people that you usually ask around. Oh, I have an opening. Is someone interested in a position in our office? So you're going to have to do something different. So that includes reaching out to the affinity bars. There are so many affinity bars, Black attorney organization. There's, of course, Hispanic bar. I know the Black bar is known as Garden State Bar. There's Black women lawyers. There's Asian Pacific lawyers. There's South Asian Lawyer Bar Association. There are so many, but the word of mouth should be spread out to those organizations as well, so they can help fill in the gaps where these organizations are looking for individuals that are different and look different and have a different lived experience from the individuals that they usually hire. And so that brings me to the next point, which is I want to also highlight for our listeners what some tips are as they go back into the trenches on a day-to-day basis. And so our tips that we're going to leave you with is, number one, step up and say something. So in many of our cases, we always, and those of us who have been doing this work long enough, we know when something doesn't feel right. And so, but we feel uncomfortable in the setting that we're in, which is usually in the courtroom, whether it's via Zoom, whether it's in person. And we feel uncomfortable bringing up this R word, the racism word. No one wants to hear that. But it's important for our allies and each and every one of us to step up and say something when we see something. And that just may be asking a question on the record. Judge, I'm concerned that this family is being treated very differently from another family that I saw in a similar situation last week. Do you recall that case, Your Honor? And Your Honor, could we do a quick sidebar? Because I want to remind Your Honor what case I'm referring to. And then you can, update the judge and then come back on the record and put the issues on the record that you're concerned about.
That's good, Classy.
Yeah. No, definitely have to step up and say something. And I think it's also important for us to understand that each and every one of us is in a different stage on this journey of understanding what structural racism is, of trying to promote race equity in child welfare, because all of us, we have an innate desire to want to help. Right. We want to help families. We just want to get them on the right path.
Right.
But from our vantage point, what we might think is the right path for them might be the totally wrong path from their vantage point, because it's just not going to work. for
Right.
whatever reason that may be, depending on that family's circumstances. And so we have to be able to educate each other and challenge our colleagues. Are you saying that because that's what you would want your family member to do?
That's
I
good.
want you to understand that this family can't do that. And this is because this family has had to deal with generational poverty, generational redlining. Nobody is a homeowner because of redlining, because they have been denied loans. They've been denied opportunities to get access to money to buy a home. So, what you're suggesting, while it's well intended, it's not going to work for this family. And this is why. So we have to be able to educate each other as well as educating the court. Because again, judges, they often are coming from a good place too. They want to help, they want to support,
Right.
but they're also usually looking at the circumstances from their own vantage point, a middle class standard. And a middle class standard often does not work for our families.
Right.
They do not live middle class lives. And unfortunately, many of them will never have access to a middle class life because of all of the things that you and I spoke about earlier in this episode. So that brings me to our tips. What can you do now that you have all this information? And so I'm going to break up our tips in two different categories. I'm first going to give tips for our racial justice warriors who are in the trenches with us, those who are advocates. And the number one is, when you see something, say something. And this happens many times. Our allies will see that a Black or a brown family is being treated differently, or being asked to do more things than, say, a white family that had a similar case earlier in the month, perhaps earlier in the week, and sometimes even on the same day. And so this may be a situation where you will say on the record, Your Honor, I noticed that this family is being treated in a certain way and being asked to complete certain services. And we previously had another case that had similar circumstances, and that family wasn't asked to do that. Your Honor may not recall what case I'm speaking about, and then you can ask for a sidebar and refresh the judge's recollection, and then come back on the record and say, Your Honor, I think we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, why is this family being asked to do this when we didn't ask a previous family to do the same thing? And another important tip is to be okay with saying the R word, racism or race. Many times we shy away from those two words because we don't want to bring up this topic. But for better or for worse, racism is a part of the history of this country. It has permeated in all of our institutions, including the child welfare area. And we know that. And so it's okay to educate the court and educate your colleagues about this issue regarding race and racism and structural racism, and highlighting the role that has played in the lives of the families that you're working with on a day-to-day basis. And then our tips for our general public, individuals who are listening, who may not necessarily be advocates in the system, but want to be able to help. We're suggesting that you contact your local social justice agency and be part of the movement to reimagine the child welfare area. Be part of that. There's so many organizations throughout the nation who are focusing on this issue relating to racism in the child welfare area, or racial inequities in child welfare. Become part of that, so that way you can be part of this push to reimagine the child welfare space. And then for those who are currently involved in a case in the child welfare area, we are suggesting that you talk with your family advocate about how you can personally overcome some of these systemic barriers that exist and that prevent you from keeping your family together. Have a candid conversation with your advocate. Broach the topic, because again, race and racism are topics that we often shy away from because we don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable. It's not any of our fault that racism is part of the child welfare area. It's just a fact. And so it's okay to bring that up and talk with your family advocate about that. Also, if you're in a child welfare case currently, share the link to this podcast. Let your family advocate listen to Torn. This would be a great way to broach the topic and will hopefully lead to an in-depth conversation with your family advocate about how both of you can work together to make sure that you are not a victim of racism in the system, and instead that your family advocate takes this as an opportunity to make a difference and help turn your case around by letting the other stakeholders in your case know that they have to be mindful of structural racism. They have to be mindful of the historic barriers that have been put in place with respect to keeping families separated based on things like psychological evaluations that we already talked about have historically been used to promote racial hierarchy and promote racism and racial discrimination. And so we want to thank each and every one of our listeners for joining us today. We always are so happy when all of you take time out of your day to listen to us. Sonia and myself were very grateful for the fact that you thought it was important to take a moment or two in your day to join us for another, and what we hope has been a very informative discussion and lively discussion. As always, if you have a tip or insight or something that you want to share with us, you can always feel free to email us at tornwithcns @gmail.com. That's TORNWITH, the letter CANDS @gmail.com. You can also please continue to listen to us on the platform that you use to listen to podcasts, and also follow us on your favorite social media platforms. We want to connect. We want to stay in touch. And until next time, enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
The opinions and views expressed on this podcast are those of its hosts and guests and represent our own lived experience. The views and opinions expressed do not reflect those of any agency or organization with which we may be associated.